QSO Today, episode 386, Dave Jensen, W7DGJ. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom have played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is coming back on March 12th and 13th. We already have a huge list of interesting presentations and speakers. We created an opportunity for your radio club or nonprofit organization to come to the expo to be in our exhibit hall. If the pandemic has allowed your club to grow beyond its physical borders, then consider reaching out to our 6,000 to 10,000 visitors to the expo by having a booth. Please contact me. I will be sending out an invitation for presentation moderators and volunteers for the expo in the next week or so. I will put a button to a form on the expo website. Please use the expo banners in the show notes pages to get to the expo website. Finally, our $10 ticket for the expo will go on sale on February 1st. The early bird ticket will have full use of the expo and all of its offerings during the expo and its 30-day on-demand period. Dave Jensen, W7DGJ, found his way into amateur radio from volunteering to help disabled Korean War veterans who were active amateurs in a Cleveland, Ohio Veterans Hospital. From that interaction grew a love of radio and communications that has lasted a lifetime. Dave likes to work CW on 17 meters and build his own equipment. W7DGJ is my QSO today. W7DGJ, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Dave?
Yes, I am, Eric. Good to hear from you.
Dave, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Good question. I guess I've always been fascinated with the concept of long-distance communications without wires. As a kid, I was a science junkie. I loved any aspect of science or engineering. 8 or 10 years old, I was reading science fiction stories, lie in bed at night thinking about radio waves and, here's imagining I could see them and these things hopping through the atmosphere, carrying information along with them. And my dad was an electrical engineer, I should say. He ran an institute that General Electric had called Nela Park in Cleveland, Ohio. And it was a training institute where other electrical engineers would come. And I'd occasionally get dragged along if I had to go with him or if he brought me to something he thought I would find interesting. But I would be at this institute where he was doing a talk, or he had specialists who were doing a talk on various aspects of electrical engineering. I picked up a lot of interest in electronic things from my dad, and that would help me, I think, in the early days, get interested in these topics, cool radio waves and so forth.
Did you have hobbies like trains or anything like that beforehand?
Oh, yeah. Loved model trains. I was a stamp collector. I sound like a real nerd. That's okay, though.
A sign of the times.
Yeah. So imagine this nerdy kid, 8 or 10 years old, reading a magazine called Boy's Life. I don't know where you were raised. You remember that one?
Oh, absolutely. I had a great-grandmother that gave us a subscription every year.
That's how I got mine. I think it was an aunt. And this subscription was something I would pore over every one of those issues. They would have articles that were serial stories, maybe westerns or sea adventures and so forth. But they would also have stories about interesting hobbies and things you could do or make in your garage and so forth. And they had a lot of ads in the back of that thing that were always interesting. One of the ads that I would remember poring over, of course, there was one ad that showed a young guy on a beach having sand kicked in his face by a bully. You remember that one?
I think those are Charles Atlas ads or something.
Yeah. Well, I think I bought one of those devices I don't remember what it was called, but it's just some kind of a squeeze thing where you squeeze it together and you're supposed to like pump yourself up to be a muscle man. I remember buying that and thinking what a ripoff it was. I don't know why, but I got suckered into buying stuff through the mail with Boys Life magazine. And there was this item, I don't know if you'd call it a toy or it looked like a really cool science fiction device to me. It was called the Big Ear. And my friend, Don, down the street, he lived about 10, 12 houses away. We looked at this thing and had a picture of a young kid with a pair of headphones on. And they weren't today's headphones. They were the kind of headphones you think of with a doctor and a stethoscope, those little things plugged into your ear, go under your chin. And this stethoscope earphone was plugged into this big red parabolic disc that had a microphone in it at the very center. And supposedly, and they showed this kid with a sort of a snarky looking or sneaky face. And he was looking at a couple of girls that were like 2 blocks down the street. And he had it pointed at them as if he was hearing everything that they were saying. So this Big Ear was a really cool device. Now, we weren't thinking of it so much as sneaking conversations out of the girls on our street. We were thinking of, I'll put one in my bedroom, you put one in your bedroom. We're 12 houses away. We'll point them at each other. And anytime we want, we can just talk without any kind of wires or anything between us. And so these Big Ears arrived one day. We hooked them up. And they didn't hear anything better than you could without it. I mean, it was just a total, complete mail order fraud, a cheesy piece of junk. So it was a very disappointing element. But you could tell just by the fact that I wanted to talk across great distances without any kind of wires. So what's the next step in a kid's development? Somebody gives you a set of walkie-talkies, right?
Right.
I'm sure you had those, right?
Also. And field phones with wires. Sure.
That's exactly it. At age 11 or 12, walkie-talkies ended up playing a big part of my life. Somebody gave me for Christmas, probably my dad, a set of walkie-talkies. I think what they put out 100 milliwatts or something. So you think about it. I researched it before this meeting with you to see if I could find out what frequency that even those things were on. I couldn't find out anything about them, but they had a limit.
I think they were 11 meters, actually.
That's probably it. That's probably where CB came from. So these walkie-talkies, we had them, and every guy on the street had them. I mean, walkie-talkie.
Every kid your age had them.
Yeah, that's right. Every kid my age had them. And when you're a kid, you measure your life in summers. And there was one summer, I have no idea what year it was, but I must have been 10 or 11. So we all had these walkie-talkies. We'd engage in these paramilitary-like maneuvers in the woods behind our houses. We lived in a beautiful place in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and suburban setting, but it was a little development built right on a big woods. So it was easy for the kids to just disappear into the woods with their walkie-talkies, break up into teams, and have these paramilitary-like maneuvers. And it was a blast. Connecting via the walkie-talkies, it must have lasted 6 months of our lives. It ended when some idiot, one of my good buddies, threw a CO2 cartridge from his air rifle into the campfire. You know what a CO2 cartridge is, don't you?
Yeah, I remember them.
Yeah, well, they're, the compressed air that pushes out the BBs out of your air rifle. He threw one of those onto a campfire. The thing exploded like a grenade. Of course, it could have killed any one of us. It sent a 3-inch piece of metal shrapnel flying through the neighboring house about a quarter of a mile away. So it was the end of all paramilitary maneuvers in the woods. But those walkie-talkies were critical. That was fun. And that really started me thinking about, conversing across the waves of airspace. And then I would lie at night and listen to AM radio and do DXing with AM radio. Did you ever do that, Eric?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was hooked from a very early age, just like you.
Just like me. I bet a lot of people were. This was a time when, if you look at where a lot of the older guys in ham radio come from and where they were first licensed, they're all back in late 50s, early 60s, mid 60s. You're, of course, later than that. But
I came later. I'm younger.
So this AM radio DXing was fun. Somebody gave me a transistor radio, and I would lie there. And there were certain times at night where you could just hear these radio stations coming in on clear channels from faraway cities, Chicago, oh my gosh, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, New York City. And I found out that if you wrote those stations, you could tell them what you heard. I heard so-and-so disc jockey. I heard a Clearasil commercial on 11:05 p.m. You wrote them and tell them what you heard. They would send you a little card, a little postcard. At least a lot of them would. I would take those postcards and pin them up on my wall. And that was the first QSO card that I had lots of plastered all over my walls. And we would call it skip radio listening. I don't know what else other people called it, but my buddies and I would talk about what we happened to pick up the night before. And we had some favorite DJs in different cities of North America. So I took that AM DXing and kind of did the natural transition to shortwave listening. I remember my dad, as an engineer, very supportive of the hobby. He drove me over to Allied Radio. Did you ever hear of Allied Radio?
Oh, I had the catalogs. What kid didn't?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, those catalogs were like just the Bible of what was available. And
it was the wish list of all the things you wish you could buy.
Yeah, it's just like a DXE or ham radio outlet catalog now. Sits in, just got one in every room. You pick it up and just dream about what the next piece of gear is going to be. So I got what was called a Star Roamer. It was my first shortwave receiver, and I had a blast with that thing. It was a night kit, but I didn't put it together. It was assembled. I had the world map up on the wall. I would push pins in all the countries that I picked up on the radio. I have a picture on my QRZ page of me sitting there in front of this shortwave radio. And I thought that was as far as it could go, man. It's, have a cool radio like that and be connected to the world, listening to these faraway stations. I could hear some of the ham bands and read the mail on some of those conversations that the hams were having, but I never actually thought that I could do that. It seemed like a bunch of older guys and talking about older guy things, and it never connected with me that I could actually be a ham.
What was the event that changed your mind?
Sure. I was a Boy Scout, and as a Boy Scout, I was kind of a mediocre Boy Scout. I had friends who were Eagle Scouts, and they had gone all the way, going, after every single merit badge they could get. And one of them, my friend Jeff Suba from up the street, I admired this guy. He was really a cool guy, and I wanted to give it a try and be like Jeff and go for the gold and get as many merit badges as possible. But I wasn't very good at collecting merit badges. There was one that looked like I could do it. It was called volunteering. It was a volunteering merit badge. And I looked around to see if there was any way I could get to any of those places without a car. And a lady up the street worked at the Wade Park Veterans Hospital in East Cleveland. And she got me a volunteer gig there. I remember showing up on a Saturday morning, and the guy I was supposed to report to had no idea what to do with this kid who had showed up to help out, quote unquote, at the Veterans Hospital. He had me for a few weekends. I was working half days in the rec room, just talking to people, helping out the veterans wherever I was needed. But I kind of felt like a third wheel, and it really wasn't a lot of fun.
Did you do it in uniform?
Yeah. Yes, I did it in uniform. That's right. And so here's this young Cub Scout. And of course, veterans, must have enjoyed it. I remember talking to guys that were coming back from, had come back from the Korean War who were injured and so forth. But I didn't find lots of camaraderie there. I just found it, to be somewhat helpful to be on my way to get a volunteering merit badge. And the guy who brought me on said, we've got a radio room here. There's a couple of these guys who are radio operators. They're pretty badly injured from the Korean War, and they might need some help. Does that sound interesting? That really sounded cool. I mean, compared to sitting around talking to people and bringing magazines to people in the rec room. So they brought me down to the radio room, and I met these two fellows, and I had your questions before this conversation were, please identify those early Elmers. And I wish I could remember their call signs. There was Tom and there was Joe. Joe's last name was Krasinski, or how to spell that, I have no idea. He had a huge Polish ham sign in the ham shack, a sign off the side of a case of ham, actual Polish ham. And he had that Polish ham sign in the radio room. And I remember what an interesting couple of guys these were. They were completely paraplegic. They couldn't move their heads. They had, tubes that would go into their mouths so they could drink water. They had the use of one hand. And Eric, you wouldn't believe what they could do with that one hand. You put a bug in that hand, and I have never today even heard anyone who worked CW as well as these two little skinny, less than 100-pound paraplegic veterans who could talk to people as fast as we're talking now on CW. It was just absolutely remarkable to me. So for a few weeks, I just watched and learned. And here I am, this, to them, I'm sure this privileged kid from Cleveland Heights, never met a veteran in his life, let alone a terribly wounded one. Suddenly I'm an assistant to these guys and helping them with their lives and so on. It was it was quite an experience. So they recognized in me an interest in becoming a ham, and they didn't have to work hard to convince me to take my novice exam. So I became the WN8VDY, Victor David Yankee. I became WN8VDY at the age of about 15 years old. And it was one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had in my life, just being worked with by these two radio hams that were kind enough to teach me the code and at the same time, give me the confidence to go ahead and take the test. And I think it was only 5 words a minute you needed to get licensed as a novice back then. I don't recall. But those two guys were incredibly important to me in my early upbringing.
And now this message from ICOM America. Now, after you've cleaned up your holiday decorations, admired the colorful socks and ties from your well-meaning significant others, it's time to get what you really wanted on your holiday wish list. Spice up your ham shack with ICOM's new ID52A handheld radio, now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF channels this winter season. The ICOM ID52A is ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio that is VHF and UHF dual band with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star, simplex, repeater mode, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode. Integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square locations, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. Can you believe it? For more information, please click on the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes page at qsotoday.com. So get that new radio that was missed on your list, and when you purchase your new ICOM ID52A or any other amazing ICOM radio or accessory, please tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, did they give you the novice exam?
They did. Joe gave me the novice exam. I had to, later when I upgraded my license, I had to drive some considerable distance to the FCC office, but they gave me my novice exam and tested me on my code. I remember I was so pleased that I was actually copying like 7 or 8 words a minute. And so I passed in flying colors. They had a beautiful station there at the VA hospital, WA8VA. It was a big national amplifier with a full legal limit. Some great antennas up on the roof of this big hospital. It was a tall building and, really put out a good signal through some Yankees or whatever they had on the roof. A room full of top-of-the-line Collins gear. I got 2 merit badges that summer, both for volunteering and then one for radio as well.
Well, that's a great story. So how did you upgrade?
I upgraded to WA8VDY by studying on my own. I picked up that book from the ARRL. You see it, it's ubiquitous. You see it in a lot of old ham shack pictures about how to be an amateur radio operator. And then there was a companion book for studying for the next test. I don't even remember what it was called back then, Eric. My memory is fading. I'm probably at
the General Class License Manual, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. And it seemed to be a really big deal to get to whatever that was, 13 words a minute. It seemed like like that was really a tough haul for me. I remember that.
I remember too. It was hard.
Do you? Yeah. It was tough, but I did it. And, later when we talk about the ham radio hobby, I think we're kind of missing something by not by taking the code requirement away.
Did you practice on the air as a novice? Did you have a transmitter?
Yeah, I had a transmitter. I had a DX60 Heath kit. Oh man, did I have an experience with that thing. I'm never, at that point in time, I said, I will never build a kit again. I actually had a very nice setup. I had a DX60. I had the HR10 receiver and an HG10 VFO. I bought the receiver and VFO assembled, used, but the DX60 I built. I thought, hey, I'm this great assembler of ham radio gear, soldering iron in hand, and thought that I had done a great job. Boy, that was an exciting process building that thing. And it was a real kit. I mean, some serious soldering had to go on to build a DX60. And at the end of the line, I plugged it in. And I remember, Eric, I sat there and looked at it when I plugged it in and turned it on. And it was smoking. And it smelled bad. And more smoke poured out of it. And I just sat there looking at it. I had no idea why I looked at it so long until I unplugged it. But it actually started burning. And I unplugged it immediately as soon as I saw flames. But the whole thing was a bad experience. Let me put it that way. It stunk so bad. Have you ever smelled anything electrical that's burning?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Electrolytic capacitors burning up.
Yep, that's exactly what happened. So this...
Or a transformer melting down because it's shorted.
That's right. So here this $80 or $99, I don't remember how much it was, but it was by today's standards, probably $500. But back then it was only $79, $75. This kit burned up in front of me, stunk the house up for days. I mean, 2 weeks later, you could still smell the burning DX60. And the strange part about it was I learned something else about it besides the fact that I was a terrible assembler of kits. I learned something about it then, about the ham radio community, because at this point in time, Joe and Tom at the VA had introduced me to a lot of local hams, and everyone was so nice. Everyone in the ham radio hobby was friendly and willing to help you. Here's a 15-year-old kid. Let's give him a hand. I've got this piece of gear. You want to have it? I don't need it. You're putting up a dipole. We'll come out and we'll help you with it. My mom and dad were so impressed. I had these older guys coming out, fooling around with the gear, getting it set up and so forth, getting the station working, grounded and so forth. I had so much of a positive experience with the ham radio community. Then I had this DX60 go south, and one of the ham radio operators said, well, you ought to take it to old so-and-so down the street. He's a repair guy. He's a ham too, and they'll fix it for you. And so I thought, hey, that's great. I'll take it down to this fellow and get it fixed. So I took the DX60 down to this guy, and he looked it over. And of course, sniffing it, looking at it, his case open, and a little embarrassing for me. He said, I can deal with this. We'll replace this and this. You'll have it back in no time. Well, I was really happy about that. But by golly, when he brought it back to me, he presented my dad with an invoice for something like $120. And that was a lot of money back then. So here, this guy fixed my DX60, quote unquote, for $120 and did replace it and get it working properly. But my whole view of ham radio went to hell in a handbasket, so to speak, because I realized that, hey, some people are just out for the money, just like in anything else. They're in it for the money. And maybe he should have warned this young kid that it was going to cost an awful lot to restore that DX60. But, hey, that was a long time ago. I learned my lesson.
So did you get it on the air? Were you an active novice?
I was an active novice. I was CW. CW was my mode of operation. I loved it. I remember having a very small QRP rig that I actually enjoyed as much or more than the DX60. Do you remember those days, Eric? You could actually, and it's probably still true today, but I just think there's too many too many amplifiers out there, too many CW signals back with a 1.5 kilowatts. You could take 2 watts, or, I think I had something that was 1.5 watts, and I was able to get, New York and California and, all kinds of activity with that little QRP rig and a bug. And sure enough, that's all I needed was that and the receiver. And I just had a blast with the QRP. So I haven't done that recently, but one of these days I'll get back into QRP. I just think it's a little more difficult now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, because I know you're a CW operator.
No, I think it's getting better, actually. With Cycle 25, it's getting better. And certainly, it seems to me, because everybody's either on the digital modes or they've gone someplace else, that there's plenty of room for CW operation on almost all bands.
Well, I didn't mean so much that CW is going away. I think CW is here, and I love CW, but it's just so difficult to imagine getting on the air with 1.5 watts. And I think that's the difficulty. But there are people doing it, and there are real enthusiasts. And
well, I think there's a lot of people doing it. I think you'd be surprised. Maybe you're not working DX every time, but I think a lot of the SOTA guys are not carrying. They're not carrying a lot of power up on the hilltop swing.
No, that's true. That's right. I listened to your last podcast, and it was real interesting about the SOTA and working CW with just a few watts. And so that's true. It's still out there, and I'll have to get back into it.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career? I mean, here you are, a 15-year-old ham radio operator. Did that make you want to become some kind of electronic professional?
Absolutely. I wanted to go into radio. I just, I could see myself working in the back of a radio station, dealing with the transmitters and climbing a tower and so forth. That's what I really thought I was going to end up doing. And I did choose communications when I went off to school, communications degree from Ohio University. Ohio University was a local, a few hundred miles away university, but I still had to go live in a dorm and everything. I chose communications without really thinking too much about it, just sort of understanding that was kind of what, where you would be if you wanted to work in radio. And I had a face that was great for radio. So I thought, what the heck, I'll go into radio and take communications there. But it turned out to be more of a journalism degree, which was really at first kind of disappointing to me. You go in thinking that you're going to be playing with transmitters, you're going to be working with all kinds of gear. And as I said, climbing towers, and you end up having to write stories and write news reports and so forth. I mean, there were some fun moments, but it was a little change from what I had expected as a kid.
Were you involved with the radio station on the campus?
Yes, I was. I had a really cool experience here. I was an intern at the radio station, and then I worked in the radio station for some time. And I would like to stay on the technical side. I didn't get out front and become a DJ, et cetera. But I did work in the newsroom and followed the teletype machine and so on. And those old teletype machines, they had bells on them. And when there was a minor news story coming in, it would just type it up without any kind of announcement. But it was a major news story. It might have a bell that goes off on it. A really major news story, it would have 2 bells. And then there were 3 bells on the teletype machine to indicate that, a nuclear war had begun or something. So I'm in the newsroom one day, and all of a sudden there's 1 bell. And thought I'd go over and quick read that. And I'm starting to follow this teletype machine as it's spitting out the news. And a second bell, and a third bell. And oh my God, I was scared. And it turned out that, it was a big news story. It wasn't a nuclear war, but it was the fact that 4 student protesters were shot dead by the National Guard on the Kent State University campus, which was our neighboring school. It was just, a short distance away, Kent State. So, protesters during the time of the Vietnam War, they weren't supposed to be shot. So it was a major news story. And it was kind of exciting to be the one to write that up and get it on the air. It was fun.
So what happened after that?
What happened after that was I went back to get my gear, my ham radio gear, set up a station at college. And this is about 2 years later. My ham radio career has been a long one, faced with long periods of interference from other things, girls.
QRM.
Yeah, right. Girls, radios, college jobs, and so forth. But so I spent a couple of years away from the hobby and then went back to get my gear. And I remember my parents had said, they had written me, and we didn't have a lot of phone conversation. Calling people at the time was expensive, and I was a broke student. So, I'd get a letter from mom, so forth. I got a letter one day that said, Dave, if you don't clean up your room, we're going to dispose of this stuff because Dad wants to make it his study. And I said, okay, well, when I get around to it, year and a half later, I was going down there to get around to it. I went back home, and sure enough, they had disposed of all my ham radio equipment.
No.
Yes, my entire station was gone. They even yanked the dipole out of the trees. I don't know why. That didn't bother anybody, that wire. But they pulled everything down and got rid of it. They donated it to local Goodwill, or at the time it was something else that they donated to, but a similar kind of environment. So I can just imagine somebody buying that DX60 that I had paid $75 for and $110 or $120 to fix. I can just see them buying that for $20 or something like that. So I lost my station. But Eric, there was something worse that I lost. I lost a box of at least 200 comic books that I had under my bed. They were all brand new, mint condition, including R. Crumb. I don't know if you remember R. Crumb, but it was really kind of shady, almost pornographic comic books that were sold around the 60s, really stuff that today is worth $1,000, for a perfect copy of edition 1, et cetera, and so on. I lost 200 of those. She said they were filthy, and I threw them away. So I lost not only my station, I lost probably something that I would have been able to sell now and buy a nice house. So that's what you get when you're a kid and you leave home and leave your room full of stuff.
And the problem is, your mind's eye, you picture your parents actually doing this with a vengeance, right? They may not have been doing it with a vengeance, but you imagine them together, working together, ripping that dipole out of the tree and thinking, I'll show that.
Yeah, they didn't do it like that.
That may not be the way it happened, but I think I remember at that age thinking that was what they were thinking.
I think you're right. That's probably what it was that I consider it to be far more terrible than they considered it. It's just some hobby that I had lots of hobbies, I think I'd lost my stamp collection during that time. The train set probably got donated to Goodwill as well. I had lots of hobbies, and to them it was just another hobby that David lost interest in. But it would be important. I think it's for any ham today to have your first station. I think that's kind of important.
Well, you can always go back and recreate that station if you wanted to.
Yeah, I know. Those boat anchors are still out there and available.
They are. You can find them on eBay.
Mm-hmm.
What happened with your career? Where did it go?
So I graduated at a time when there was a terrible recession. Here I thought I would go into radio, either be a technician or be engaged in journalism at the radio or TV side. And it was a really, really bad time to find a job. And I knew, my core interest, Eric, has always been gear, electronic gear. So there's another side of electronic gear, and I fell into that for what seemed like a lifetime. That was stereo equipment. I worked for an electronics company when I got out of school. I worked for a company, you're not going to believe the name, Tokyo Shapiro. Tokyo Shapiro. Tokyo Shapiro. It was a chain of electronics supplier in the Cleveland, Ohio area, something like 14 different stores. And they had everything electronic, like today's Best Buy, et cetera. They had everything electronic, and I started working for them just because I couldn't find anything else in my area of expertise, and became quite expert at moving boxes, so to speak, getting that equipment up and out to the consumer, and was a store manager for a while and so forth. I didn't mention this, but one of the things I love the most about ham radio from the early days, just opening a piece of gear. I love a radio. You open it up, it smells good, it looks good, you plug it in, it has a nice smell as it starts to become accustomed to where it's sitting on your desk. You read the manuals, you look at the stuff, you take the lid off, you look inside to see how nice and neat the wiring is. You see the beauty of the electronic assembly and so forth. And you can think about that the same way with stereo equipment. It's the same exact way. A big power amplifier for a hi-fi gear.
Burning in, right? That's the idea.
The burning in, right? Yeah. So I love electronic gear, and that's why I stayed in that job for a few years, and it was fun. I eventually moved from that role to a role with a company that should be known in the ham radio business, but it isn't as well known as it could be. I mean, I tried to get them to focus on products for the ham radio operator. The company was called Technica.
Oh, sure.
So if you're looking for a great pair of headphones for your ham radio operator, that's a good brand to consider. I'm wearing them right now as I talk to you, and I swear Technica still makes some of the best headphones around.
I'm using their microphone.
There you go, a microphone. Well, that was the business that I was in.
The ATR 2100.
That's a great mic.
Unique microphone, yeah.
So I started with Technica when they were just a company that sold quote-unquote magnetic transducers. And magnetic transducers, any kind of any item that transforms one kind of energy to another as a transducer. Well, they called them magnetic transducers, but they were simply phono cartridges. That was the tie between one job and another. I was in the stereo equipment business. I moved to a company that made stereo phono cartridges with the needle and, of course, playing records and so forth. But that company rapidly transitioned to making really great microphones and really great headphones. And I had the fun of being with the company when they came up with their first microphone. And we played around with those in the professional market for a while until we got some respect. And I was responsible as the product manager for microphones that were sold to performers like Ted Nugent or Neil Sedaka. Who were some of the other ones?
Of those times, Linda Ronstadt.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, I went to a industry convention for my business at Technica, and Linda Ronstadt performed live for an audience of about 200 people at the convention. It was really great. It was a fun business to be in. I got to follow some of these crazy performers for example, I would take a really beautiful aluminum case, and I had 10 or 12 microphones in that, fit into the foam of this aluminum case. And I would take it into Ted Nugent's dressing room when he's about to give a concert to several thousand people out in the audience. And he would look at these mics, and they were gold-plated ones and so forth. And he would select the mic that he was going to use that night and so forth. And I would get to be in the dressing room or the room that they would be in to prepare for their crazy acts and so forth. And I remember Ted, he's this person who now is extremely outspoken, conservative guy. At the time, he was, hair down to the back of his neck, or back of his back, I should say, and you would think a guy that would have all kinds of drugs and booze and everything in the dressing room. He kept all that stuff out of there. He just wanted water. That was at a time when all the performers had beer and everything else going in the dressing room. So I was surprised at that.
At least.
Yeah, right. And he was a clean-cut guy for everything he did except for his appearance. So anyway, it was fun because I got to know the music industry, and I got to sell and promote this wonderful line of microphones. Now, why they didn't take that line of mics, they could have been the Heil microphone of those years and with a big market share today, I'm sure. But no, they didn't think it was a big enough marketplace, so they didn't pursue that.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I thought Audio-Technica was a relatively new company when it came to microphones. Were they just selling very high-end microphones, studio microphones? Because the Shure SM10 seemed to be what dominated most of the places, nightclubs and stuff like that.
SM58 as well. So you had these Shure microphones that were dominating, as you say, nightclubs, live performers, and it had a very distinctive appearance. And that was the appearance that all performers wanted in a microphone. I mean, they literally did not want to hold a microphone that had a different appearance than the SM10 or the SM58. And Audio-Technica made the mistake of making some very high-quality microphones at the beginning that just didn't look like those. They looked a little old-fashioned, or they didn't have the design features of Shure microphones. So they were relegated to the lower-level kinds of uses. They were, sold to consumers for tape recorders and so on. And it wasn't until they started designing their microphones to fit the hand of the performer that they really became used professionally. And so this was about the year 1979 or so, 1980, that Audio-Technica really hit the professional market with microphones in a big way.
And how long did you stay with Audio-Technica?
I was probably there for a decade, and then I moved from Audio-Technica to a very short stay with a rather cool time for a transition. So, do you remember when LPs were out and CDs were coming in, and everyone thought, well, let's get rid of the record collection? I must have had 3,000 albums. I put them in my garage and had a garage sale. Worst thing I ever did, dumbest move I ever made, because now that vinyl is hot again. But at the time, we were losing market share like crazy. The Audio-Technica phono cartridge line was going down the toilet in terms of revenue. So, the company had to rely on microphones and headphones for their business. And I made a move at the time to the CD industry. I made a move to a company that was the first record label to have CDs. It was called Telarc Records, a classical and jazz line. I was a vice president at the company, but I was only there a short time and I got canned. It was, one of those experiences where I just didn't fit the culture of the company. And to anyone who's ever lost a job that they didn't intend to lose, I'm sure we've all had one of those experiences in our lives. I found, and I tell everyone this because I write about careers and so forth, and what we'll get to, but I found that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Getting out of there and picking up the pieces, feeling like I lost my self-confidence and so forth, and moving to Arizona without a job and just, looking for work in a new state with a whole new kind of downbeat attitude about my life, as I had gotten fired from a company I thought I was doing a great job with. I actually came around to something really, really great. And it was wonderful for me. And I thought I would set up shop as an executive recruiter. I had been called by headhunters in the past for jobs that were various types. I interviewed for a job at Shure, making to take over their microphone marketing, but didn't get it. So I moved to Arizona and I became a headhunter. It's easy to do that, Eric. It's not a job that requires any licensing. You just hang a shingle up over your front door and it says executive recruiter, and there you go. You're a headhunter.
I think that it's a people business. That's kind of an obvious thing to say, but in order to be a good salesman or a good anything, an executive recruiter, you actually have to be very good about building a network of people that know other people so that you can find the right person for the right job. I think maybe you might sell it a little bit too softly, that to be a good executive recruiter means you've got to build a really nice big network.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. You can succeed and do pretty well if you're average at that, but it does, if you're going to get to be in a particular industry sector. I chose science and engineering. If you're going to get into science or engineering and talk to the best people in their fields, whatever their fields are, you have to be, as you say, a people person, and you have to be able to, just like you're doing on your QSO Today podcast, you have to be able to probe and get information from people and make them comfortable. And that's exactly what a recruiter does. And of course, you can't sound like a salesman. You're talking to a scientist or an engineer. If I'm talking to an electrical engineer about a role in a company that makes ham radio equipment, for example, you cannot sound like a salesman to that engineer. It's just not the way to get things done. You have to sound like you're genuinely interested, and if he or she happens to have an interest in what you've described, that's fine. But if they don't, that's fine as well. You basically set the stage with people that you're there to help them. And it's not a job where you're finding jobs for people, so to speak. That might be one kind of headhunter that you might think of. But no, that's not what I do. What I have done for 30 years now has been to work for companies, so employers retain us. It's called a retained executive search firm. They engage us as a consultant when they want a new engineer, when they want a new director of marketing, et cetera. And then we go out, survey the marketplace, and find that person. And it's been a lifetime of very interesting conversations. I can't even describe how much pleasure I get, Eric, out of talking to an expert in some field or another, and how much I learn about those fields. With electronics, in science, for example, in biotechnology, talking with people who are, that top guy in the world who knows how to make biodegradable plastics out of a bacteria, those kinds of things. You talk to people and you get an amazing worldly education. So actually my life, my career has been one of continuous education. And I've loved that about it. That's been the highlight, really.
But don't you find, though, that you started doing this before we had social media and LinkedIn and all that stuff? American culture is that you're not really supposed to talk about yourself. So if you're interviewing an engineer for a potential position, and he's not going to tell you everything because he's been trained to be humble. It could be almost like extracting teeth to get everything that you want from a person just so that you can be able to refer him to somebody else. Did you find that to be the case?
Oh, Eric, you are speaking the truth. I mean, you wouldn't believe how accurate you are in that. And it's not just because that's the way people are brought up. I think you're right. People are brought up. You don't necessarily self-promote, so to speak,
Right. It's not polite.
It's not polite. It doesn't sound right, et cetera. But I try to engage people in a way that allows them to do that and to feel safe while doing that. Because self-promotion is something that you absolutely have to have if you're going to consider moving jobs. If you're going to change your job and you're going to go put your toes into the water of the very fast-moving stream of interviewing, and you start out with your potential hiring manager, and then you move to the head of human resources, and then you meet the CEO. At each of those steps along the way, you have to self-promote. So what you've mentioned, the engineer, for example, engineers are typically not self-promoters. And in fact, they're somewhat inwards. I mean, they're a little bit, they're not necessarily the outgoing salesman, so to speak. So, if I was a recruiter working with salesmen, I wouldn't have to worry about this. If I was placing salesmen here and there, but that's not what I do. I work with scientists and engineers, and they're extremely hard to get information out of. And you have to, as I said, you can't sound like a salesman. You have to be the sort of individual that will listen and ask good questions about their science, about their technology. Tell me, John, what did you do to that amplifier to make that LDMOS come across with so little concern about its heat sensitivity compared to the earlier LDMOS? What is it that you did there? Tell me about what the problem was and how did you approach it and so forth. I always tell them to use the approach of CAR, and that is when they're talking about their accomplishments, tell me about the challenge that they faced. Tell me about their particular approach to solving that problem, and then tell me about the results. So the challenge, approach, results. That's the way to answer an interview question. And when you're give an engineer information like that and ask him or her to use that sort of formula in responding to your questions, you get a lot more detail.
It sounds like an amazing kind of opportunity. I remember I had a midlife transition, let's say a career transition, when I was in my early 40s. And one of the things that I learned was I had no idea, because I'd never been trained, how to promote myself. I actually had to pay a consultant. I think I spent like $4,000 to have somebody teach me how to market myself, because I could sell a piece of gear, but I couldn't sell myself. At that point, I actually had a family to feed and probably needed to find a job, and that's why I did it, and that's what I learned. But I also learned that a lot of people, most of us probably, we go through and we might get a formal education, might get a degree or an advanced degree, but the idea of how to promote ourselves in order to get that next job was something we were never taught.
You're right. And it is very true of people on the technical ladder, especially. So in the business world, marketers, salesmen, they're always self-promoting. They live with that day in and day out. Not so the engineer or scientist, that's for sure. So I think that the best thing I ever did as a young man was to take the Dale Carnegie course, and it was probably the equivalent of what $4,000 would be right now. Dale Carnegie course was a lot of fun, and it teaches you to open up to people. And I think that took me from being one of those quiet kinds of nerdy guys into it, which I'm still really like that, but at least I know how to relate now to people in a way that allows them to open up. So it was good. And I write about that. This is where I took what I was trained on in school and apply it to my job. I've had a column. It's over now, but for 25 years, I had a column in the leading scientific journal in the world. It's called Science. And my science column, which is published at sciencecareers.org, is called Tooling Up. And every month for those many years, for more than 2 decades, I would have to come up with fresh content for a young audience of engineers and scientists. And it was always fun to write those. I would use interviews with, just like you do, interviews with others about their life choices and so forth. I would talk about job hunting. I would talk about self-promotion, all the interview tips I could muster. And it was always fresh and fun to write about that. And it gave me something in return. It wasn't a big payback. It was, we laughed, you and I, about how much money QSO Today brings you. And I'm sure it's not much. But my Tooling Up column did the same for me. But the long run, the fact that when I call people today who are vice presidents of engineering in a company, they remember reading my column when they were a kid in school. So it really did pave the way for me to be better and better at my job.
Now, is that body of work available online?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's sciencecareers.org.
If you don't mind, you'll send me the link to your columns, and I'll put it in the show notes pages for people to read.
Oh, that would be great. There might be some people out there that would like to see what kinds of advice has been provided to young people over the years. A lot of it's STEM careers, so science, technology, engineering, and math. Those are the career choices that I write about. And getting young people into STEM careers is a lot like getting young people into ham radio, really, when you think about it. Now, these careers, getting people to want to be a scientist or an engineer is kind of difficult. They think of, you talk to a young kid about, how would you like to be a scientist? And they think of nerdy scientists. They think of all the science fiction movies where the scientists are always screwing up and creating some sort of horrible monster, through biotechnology. The role models are not necessarily great, and then you have, we beat up on today's role models, like the people on TV talking about COVID and so forth. And then the commentators will come on and make fun of them and so on. It just, it's not an easy role model to go into. So, I think you're providing a valuable service at QSO Today. Give people some role models, young people. We've got to get more lifeblood into ham radio.
It sounds to me, Dave, though, the advice that you give is timeless. People are people. And right now, obviously, we're all sacrificing everyone else's sacred cows in the media. This too will pass. And the stuff that you wrote for this kind of advice will probably, remain timeless, and I'm looking forward to actually seeing it here on the show notes pages. Let's talk about ham radio now, in case that we haven't lost the audience yet. What's the current rig?
Current rig is an IC7300, which I saw on your station as well.
Yeah, I love it.
I've got a second station with an IC7100, and I love that radio as well. I've got a vertical antenna for 2 meters and a Yaesu rig for that. And I've got a...
What is the rig? It's an FT what?
Oh, boy, I don't even remember the name. It's the best value I've ever seen on a 2 meter radio. It's 2 meter analog FM, and I just love that thing. I'm going to put it in my car. It's a recent acquisition. So
you're in the Phoenix area, so there's lots of activity there.
Oh, there's lots of activity here. For 146.52, you stay on that frequency, and you're going to hear all kinds of stuff, good and bad, and we can talk about that later. But there's another piece of gear in my shack I don't mind commenting on. It's my most proud piece of equipment. You remember when I told you about how I built that DX60 and how it smoked and burned and so forth? I thought I would never, ever build a kit again, but I did. I built a Mercury 3S amplifier. It comes from a company called KM Electronics. And I needed an amplifier, solid state. I had an AL80B for quite some time, tube amp. And I thought, I'm going to make that transition. I'm going to make that transition to solid state. And sure enough, I did that with this Mercury 3S. And it's a kit, so it scared the daylights out of me. And I could just, see burning up a $2,500 investment. And it didn't happen. It went together easily. It was 4 or 5 hours, and I was on the air with it. And honestly, it's the best thing I've ever seen. It's just like a puppy dog. It follows you wherever you go, no matter what frequency you're on. This thing just follows you along, and I'm putting out 1.2 kilowatts on just about every frequency. It's made the biggest impact on my ham radio enjoyment. And I'm testing going through a beta test now of a tuner from the same company, and I can get a tune in about a second and a half on any frequency. So, there are young companies like that, KM3KM, that are popping up in ham radio, and I think that's what's so exciting about our business, that you don't have to be a giant company. I mean, I love ICOM and Yaesu, but I would really love to have an Apache Labs or some other really cool, expensive radio. Don't have that yet. Haven't been able to afford it, but you can always pick up the magazines and start drooling over this stuff. And there's so many cool new products coming, and good companies, that support their equipment, like KM3KM.
The listeners should know that you gave a presentation, I think, in the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, where you actually talked about building this amplifier, and I'll put links to that in the show notes page. That
would be great. Steve Benyon, who's my good buddy in the local area here. Funny, he has a call sign very similar to mine. He's W7DJ. I'm W7DGJ. Steve is also a real nut for this particular amplifier. He started a Facebook group. So, check out the Mercury 3S Facebook page, which is a lot of fun. And we have about 300 users of that regularly asking questions and griping about the delivery times, because it's tough to get one, just like anything. If you look at the DX Engineering website, so many big pieces of gear, amplifiers and so on, they have long wait times right now. It's very frustrating.
Supply chain's broken, as you probably know. Try to get a Raspberry Pi.
Oh, really?
Anywhere.
Mm-hmm. When's that darn supply chain going to get fixed anyway? I'm waiting for that.
Well, you know what? They have to stop making masks and start making chips.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
You're in the center of chip country. Are there still chips being made in Phoenix?
Yeah, there are. And Motorola, is the original designer of the LDMOS, for example. They moved it out to another company, but that stuff does go on in the Tempe, Arizona area. And I know they're making chips over there, and there's a couple of different companies in the backyard that are producing chips, and I sure hope that they can start gearing up for getting this supply chain problem solved, for sure.
Right. Apparently there's thousands of cars in America that the manufacturers have made that are not shipping until they actually have chips to run them. So,
oh, gee.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it really is very costly for the auto manufacturer.
See, now it takes years to build a chip foundry.
Oh, sure does. I mean, it's that clean room scenario that, have you ever walked into a clean room?
Yeah, sure.
Have you ever seen one? I mean, actually been in one?
Yeah, I've been in one.
Yeah, so have I. They're really neat to put on this bunny suit and you go into these rooms that they don't even have a normal wall that goes down to a floor. It's a curve. The HVAC is so special and so on. I've been in virus where they're working with viruses inside clean rooms in biotechnology facilities, and they're really outrageous. Boy, lots of engineering there.
And we appreciate that as long as that stuff doesn't escape.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So you have this fancy rig, the IC 7300. You have this full gallon that you operate. What's your favorite operating mode?
Love 20 meters CW. I do go on sideband, 17 meters in particular. Love 17 meters. There's something about 17 meters, just a little bit more free of a lot of noise and so forth. It just, to me, my 7-band dipole, which is a really interesting antenna. I could have made my own, of course, and it's always fun to make your own antenna. I do have a couple of dipoles I've made myself, but the one I'm using is a Buckmaster 7-band, and it works from 80 down to 6, and it's great on 17 meters. I just get a tremendous signal, and most of the DXing I do is on 17 meters, and it's a freedom from the noise that I get on 40 and 80. So in particular, I like a daily event on 17 meters. It's called the Activity Group. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. You probably have. I didn't listen to Bud's QSO today, W3FF, but you did a podcast with Bud, and I hope he brought up the Activity Group, which is something that he and a few other guys have come up with. It's a great group of guys that meet every day at 10:30 my time, local time in Arizona. But it's at 18.157.5, and it's not a net. It's just a bunch of guys testing propagation, and it's fun. You call out a CQ on the Activity Group, and people come back from all over the country, all over the world. They have good DX stations as well, and they'll give you a quick signal report. So you get a 5.9 out of New York, a 5.7 out of Jamaica, a 5.5 in Hawaii. You don't get all those stations, and you're not making official QSOs, but you are definitely coming up with an idea of how propagation works. And then they move from 17 meters at 18.157.5. They move to 15, and I forget what the frequency is. And then after a while, they move to 12. And so this group travels on the frequencies and lets you know how the bands are operating on a daily basis. It's a lot of fun.
Do you do any of the digital modes?
Yeah, I don't do digital, and I would be geared up for doing something different and trying something new, but I just can't get excited about it, Eric. I've got to listen to some QSO Todays from people who are really big on FT8 and so on, because it has a huge percentage of the ham population. When you look at the amount of traffic out there, the number of QSOs being connected, I mean, the bulk of them, isn't it? I mean, you would know the numbers better than I would, but isn't it over 50% is in digital now?
It seems like it. When you go up and down 20, you're not hearing very much activity. During the day, I hear a lot of CW down in 20, and then I hear the digital modes, and then single sideband is kind of sparse all the way up to the top. And I think that digital modes might have saved ham radio, or maybe when I say saved ham radio, where there's a lot of equipment that's now being sold or continuing to be sold. And even through the Sunspot Cycle 24, being in the dump for the last number of years, I think that these digital modes have saved the ham radio, at least have saved HF.
It's really been important over the last couple of years of, the dregs of the sunspots. To me, it's just a personal thing. I feel like ham radio is sticking an antenna up the window and having somebody on the other side of the world doing the same thing and talking, just going from rig to rig with nothing in between. Talking from computer to computer, it doesn't get me as excited.
Right. But in episode 383 with Vince Dion, VE6LK. I actually put in on the show notes a definition of propagation ham. This word keeps coming up in a number of podcasts, including the QSO Today podcast. There's a large number of hams, I might be one of them, that we like to build stuff. We're not very good at operating. We don't spend a lot of time on the air, but we do like to build stuff and then check it out or test it out. So this propagation ham, as I define it, was originally coined in the QSO Today, episode 334, with Tim Deegan, KJ8U. And what he was saying was, at the time, and that's why he used the word, and it's kind of picked up, you build something, you put it on the air, you test it. In a digital mode like Whisper, for example, with a 0.5 watt transmitter on Whisper, you could do a lot of antenna testing with it and then go look on the internet and see where you're being heard. That has an attraction to a lot of people. In fact, in the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, we had a young man who was just in junior high school who got his license, and that's what he could afford was a Whisper transmitter with his money. And he has a great time putting out antennas and seeing where they propagate around the world.
Well, we all love antennas, don't we? I mean, that's one of my favorite aspects of ham radio as well, playing with a different antenna. And that's a good way to test it. I hadn't thought of it in that same way. I really appreciate it, Eric.
Well, I'm thinking of it as more of a learning exercise. If you're 13 years old and you've got an amateur radio license and you've got an Elmer that says, here, build this transmitter with this Whisper transmitter, and then start playing with antennas. I mean, what an educational experience that is.
That's for sure. That's right. Well, I think that using that in that way would be something that I could go for, because I need a way to stop going back and forth between outside and inside when I'm testing an antenna.
That's true. Although a way to test is you actually could use one of those digital modes, and then there's certainly a number of websites that you could look. PSK Reporter, I think, is one of those where you could actually see who hears you and what direction that antenna is actually working. That's interesting about the digital modes. I'm surprised at the number of people that actually operate them. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think that there's a lot of IC7300s that have been sold because of the digital modes.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. That's, when you think about it, that's one heck of a radio for $1,100 or $1,200, whatever that is. It's so easy now to look at all these new radios and think, boy, I love a new radio. Maybe I should replace this, but I can't. I can't replace that. I love that radio. That is the core of my shack, and it combines so perfectly with the amp that I bought. I just think it's a great combo. They even look alike. I do not have a ham radio workbench. In fact, I built the Mercury 3 amp on my dining room table. So I spread out all this stuff on the dining room table. I told you how much I love the smell and feel of a new radio and so forth. So here comes this box shipped by FedEx, and you open it up and it's like an Apple computer product. I know you're not an Apple guy, but if you open an Apple anything, it's packed so beautifully. And so this Mercury comes in and it's packed like that. I took everything out, put it on the dining room table, started putting it together. And my wife walked in and said, we have so-and-so coming here. And in 3 days, she and her husband are going to be visiting us. And that had all better be cleaned up, all that mess on the table. And wow. 3 days here, I thought I'm building something that could take a week or two, and gosh, that's going to be tough. That's a tough mission to finish it up in that time frame. And then, of course, I screwed up in building it and broke something, and I had to write to the manufacturer. Wrote them on a Friday night, thinking that I'd never hear back from them till maybe Tuesday or Wednesday of the next week. 10 minutes later at midnight Eastern time, the guy who owns the company wrote me back and gave me my solution. So I was able to finish it in 4 or 5 hours and get it the heck off the dining room table. But that's where I assemble everything. I just built a little Pacific QRP. I forget what the name of their company is, but a little dipole antenna that was well reviewed in QST magazine. I bought one and put it together on the dining room table. So unfortunately, I don't have a workbench, Eric. It looked like you have a beautiful one.
But you could have told your wife that you could have entertained the friends around the kitchen table.
Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, I have a pretty supportive gal, but it's still ham radio.
There's still limits, yeah.
Yeah, there are the comments about antennas and how ugly they are. Personally, I think antennas are the most beautiful thing in the world. I could go look at people's antennas all day long and appreciate the things I see and get ideas from them and so forth. But to my wife, they're kind of ugly.
Right. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
That's right. I don't live in an HOA, so I can put up whatever I want, but within limits, and those limits are set by my partner.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. What do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now?
Oh boy, I think the greatest challenge stems from September 11th, 1958. Do you know what happened on September 11th, 1958?
No.
On September 11th, 1958, the FCC approved citizens band radio. That was the first day you could get on the air with a citizens band radio. Funny that a tragedy, September 11th, seems to jive with other tragedies, but I think we have to avoid becoming another citizens band radio. There's a serious lack of courtesy on the air. I mean, it's scary. Because my career in ham radio has had large chunks of time where I haven't been a ham, and then I get back into it, I'm constantly thrown into situations where I remember what it was like and now what it's like now. And as I just tune the bands, I hear stuff that's just unreal. I hear people all the time tuning up their amplifiers on top of conversation. I hear people swearing and yelling at each other to get off. I hear oddballs, preaching the gospel, not speaking to any one person or another, but just talking, endlessly about something, one thing or another. I heard a station the other day going on 20 minutes, not in a QSO, just hammering away about COVID and about his beliefs of COVID. Yeah, this kind of stuff doesn't come from the hobby at its core. It really doesn't. It comes from the citizens band mentality, in my opinion. So
I'm going to push back on you a little bit on that, Dave.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that as human beings right now, we're all going through a crisis, and it's affecting us all in different ways. And I think that there obviously have always been, because on the air there have been people that are not courteous. But I think that there's a tremendous amount of human suffering happening right now, and it's coming out on the air. But it's also coming out in social media. I think has created an opportunity for people to say things to people that they would never say in person because of that amount of anonymity. Since ham radio was the original social media, I think perhaps that stuff comes out. It's anonymous. You don't know the guy that's jamming you, don't know where he is necessarily, or the guy that says stuff that I still bristle or I still am embarrassed when I hear it. But I think that that's what's happening. I think that at the moment, social media has created this opportunity, and now we're a planet in pain. We're putting it all out there.
If you ever read any of the online news sites, I don't care if it's CNN or Fox News or any place that posts news, and then you look at the comments below that article, they make you sick. It's just a sickening feeling I get when I read about, what people are saying. They're insulting each other and it's just constantly one side versus the other. So I think you're right. This comes from the times that we live in, and no one, the respect for other people is not there. I tuned in the other day to the Freewheelers. It's a friendly net that gets together each day at 3916 and 75 meter band. And I listened to the guy announce as he kicks off the Freewheelers. And he announced the amateur's code. I'll just read it. It's a 20-second read, so I hope you forgive me. But he reads off this little piece that was written in 1928 by a guy named Paul Siegel, W9EEA. And it describes the radio amateur number. It sort of reminds me of the Boy Scouts. Considerate, never knowingly operating in such a way as to lessen the pleasure of others. Loyal, offering loyalty, encouragement, and support to other amateurs and local clubs. Progressive, with knowledge abreast of science, a well-built and efficient station and operation beyond reproach. Friendly, with slow and patient operation when requested. Friendly advice and counsel to the beginner. Kindly assistance, cooperation, and consideration for the interests of others. This is the hallmarks of the amateur spirit. Balanced radio. Radio is an avocation, never interfering with duties owed to family, job, school, or community. And then finally, patriotic, with station and skills, always ready for service to your country and community. I think that's good. It's good to be reminded of that because that's kind of where we started.
Well, I think it's great that they read that online.
Yeah, they do. It's a fun net. I don't particularly like the classical nets, but that's one I would join.
If the listeners go to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website, they'll find that I've actually put that code kind of at the bottom. There's a button called Code of Conduct, and I took many of those things and actually put that at the bottom for even my Virtual Ham Expo, because I think that it's a nice thing to say, it's a nice thing to believe, it's a nice thing to repeat, it's a nice thing to follow, even if you're not on the air. Especially in these times, I think that if we all just think about how much pain we're all in before we react. My wife says, Eric, count to 10. And by the time I've counted to 10, I'm calmed down.
Diffused,
yeah, exactly right. Because we're in times now that are, I think, really trying for all of us. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio?
Oh, I love POTA. That's one thing I think that's relatively new, and POTA is just so much fun. You interviewed recently the guy who has 3,000 points from his summits on the air.
For SOTA, right.
Yeah, it was a great podcast. Good job on that one. But that is something I'll never reach. I've just got a back problem and I can't hike like that. Can't get to the top of a summit. But, POTA, you could just get into a park and pull out your gear. And, I've got a little Xiegu G90 and an Icon IC705 and, cool equipment. You get it out there with a little dipole, spend a half an hour setting up an antenna, and then you hit the POTA airwaves and you start getting all these QSOs that come back. And I don't chase awards, but I find myself chasing POTA awards. It's fun. So that's one of the things that I really love. So I would say that I think equipment-wise, I get excited about solid-state amplifiers. I'd like to see solid-state amplifiers continue to evolve, continue to get better and better. I think that, I'm not going to gravitate to tubes any longer. I've had it with tuning and load and so forth. So I dream over new equipment all the time. I pick up magazines. As I said, I've got the DX Engineering or HRO catalog sitting all over the house. And I think that's what excites me is that the stuff is always changing. Got that Apache Labs Andromeda, this new radio that's coming out mid-year. I'm trying to save my pennies for one of those. You've got all kinds of opportunities to participate in something that's advancing every year with something new. So I just think it's the technology that excites me the most about amateur radio.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
Well, I would say learn CW. I don't know if this was a big mistake from the FCC or if it was a big plus. I don't know, kind of torn. I can see both sides. When the FCC dropped the code requirement, did they let the gate open to a point where it attracts people that act like CB operators on the air? I don't know if that's necessarily the case or not. Or did dropping CW bring more people in because they thought, well, I could never learn the code. But so I guess my advice would be, if you're learning CW, even if you can only get to 10 or 12 words per minute, do it. It's the number one deterrent to Alzheimer's that I can think of. This takes your brain completely out of the mode of your normal daily life. It sets you up with new channels for using your brain, for new ways of thinking about your hobby. You find yourself, you reach a point where, for me, it was taking that course, CW Academy. God, I love that. I absolutely loved it. I went from 10 or 12 words a minute to 25 when I was done, and then I've improved it since then. So, that really made a lot of sense to me. I'm not one of these guys that, I've got this buddy of mine, I've got a few Elmers I'll mention to you before we hang up, but this guy locally, Woody, K7CQX, he can probably do 50 words a minute, and I'll never be like that. But I do love CW because it opens your brain into new ways of thinking. And there was some point in time, I can't remember when it was, maybe 15 or 20 words a minute, where suddenly I realized I don't have to write this stuff down anymore. I can just copy it in my head. It's like listening to another language. So it really is cool. It's almost a separate hobby unto itself. And that's what's so nice about ham radio. All the different subcategories of hobbies, you can go up into digital, or you can, you focus in on one particular band and, get your antennas and your monobanders up. And, so another piece of advice would be, don't wait to build your dream station. Jump in now. If you're a newcomer, grab a small radio, string up a wire. It's not a big investment. It can be. And ask my wife, it certainly, it can take over, but it doesn't have to be when you start out. I don't recommend you buy a $25 or $30 Chinese radio, but there are some terrific items out there for under $200, and the wire's next to nothing. Pretty soon you're on the air. So I would just recommend that you get into HF as soon as you can. Eric, perhaps you found this to be the case as well, but I have a number of friends that started out, they get their tech license, they get a 2-meter radio, and they start tuning through the 2-meter radio, looking for people to talk to. And quite frankly, it's not easy to get a QSO going. I mean, you can get on a local repeater for the Scottsdale Amateur Radio Club and call out again, and nobody will come back to you. I don't know why this is, but people just only use 2 meters for the local nets and so forth. They're not really monitoring it like you do when you're a 17-meter nut, or you're watching 20-meter CW and so forth.
I think I know why that is. I can explain it from my standpoint. I listen to podcasts in the car. And that's when we used to listen to the radio in the car, right? We used to listen to the radio in the car or something like that. I guess I should turn it on while I'm listening to podcasts in case somebody calls out so I can answer. And then I think too many of us now are using WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram or something like that to communicate with each other rather than picking up the microphone. I think it's bad for us on the one hand because I think that we're not justifying our use of spectrum that we have if we're not on the air.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not making a vow, but I think that I guess I should turn the radio on in my car and at least be there to answer someone that calls.
I agree with you. I think that's part of the problem right there. So as a newbie, I think you need to, I'm a VE, so a volunteer examiner for 2 systems. Both systems are used here in the Phoenix area to test new hams. And I always recommend when they walk in the door, I say, you're going for your tech? Okay. Take the general as well. What the heck? Just in case, and half the time they get their general license at the same time. That's what happened, to a lot of people. I had one friend that went all the way to extra class in the same evening as she was getting her tech license. So there are possibilities out there. Since it's multiple choice, you just never know. So go for the higher class if you can and try and get on HF. Don't just stay with UHF, VHF. So another thing I would say, this is my final recommendation to the newcomer, is to support the hobby by supporting the publications. So you join ARRL, of course, you subscribe to CQ Magazine. Too many people don't subscribe to CQ Magazine. It's a great magazine. Read the ads, support the dealers that sell the cool stuff. I mean, I wish that I had been able to keep magazines like some of the earlier ones I used to subscribe to. Throughout the years, I've always had the ham radio magazines, and then they fold up and go away. And right now, I think it's a very hard time for CQ Magazine, so I hope they don't fold up and go away.
I think for these print magazines, they rely on selling ads in those magazines in order to have money to print. And I think that one of the things that's happened with COVID is that all of these advertisers are doing a land office business without having to advertise. At least that's what they tell me. And so therefore they don't realize that if they don't put their advertising in CQ Magazine can't print.
Yeah, that's right.
So they go to virtual or they go to PDF format delivered electronically. And that's what makes this a really difficult business because you've got to have that print advertising to roll the presses.
I felt so strongly about it. I noticed Kenwood was running giant ads. I mean, front cover, back cover, inside cover in QST, and big ads in the catalogs for DX engineering and HRO and so forth, spending lots of money. and yet they would not even spend a penny in CQ magazine. And just having one major manufacturer avoid one publication can kill it. I wrote a letter to the CEO of Kenwood, and they never even replied back to me. So I don't know. It seems as if you're right. It is ads that we need to see in those magazines. If they don't advertise, those magazines will go away.
I think it's a real problem. Frankly, I try to subscribe to all of them, but I know that my subscription doesn't pay to print it and send it to me.
No, pays for the postage.
Well, for those of us who live abroad, we actually pay maybe 2 or 3 times the subscription rate for the magazine, but they're such a joy to receive in the mail every month that it's worth it, and it's a way to keep those publications alive, is just to subscribe to them. That includes, by the way, Sprat from the GQRP group in England. That's a great magazine. Electric Radio is a great magazine. Besides QST and CQ Magazine, Spectrum Monitor. These are all wonderful publications. I hope that the listeners are getting them.
Let's support them, you bet. I don't know. The future of print magazines seems to be a little bit waffly right now, but I think that in certain hobbies, I have other hobbies besides ham radio, that the journals are held together by hobbyists who support the publications, and other magazines seem to be hanging in there if they have a loyal support network. So let's give them that much.
Right. That's why we're plugging them today.
Right.
Dave, it's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I know that when I first sent you the invitation, you thought perhaps there wasn't a story to tell here, but as we always find out on QSO Today, there's always a story to tell, and I'm so glad you told it here on QSO Today.
Thanks, Eric. I really enjoyed it. You did the best job of anyone I've ever talked to, and I was interviewed by Dan Rather one time, so you do a very good job of interviewing, and you bring out the detail.
Well, thank you so much. With that, I want to wish you 73.
Thank you. 73 to you, sir. Bye now.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Dave. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W7DGJ in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item on the top of the page or in the show notes on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I am updating the website as we have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.